I told my wife my life would be better without her. Now she's trying to take everything in our divorce, and I've discovered just how far she'll go to control me. My wife, Anne, and I have been married for 13 years. I am 43, and she is 46. We do not have children. When we first began dating, nobody could make me happy like Anne. She always seemed to know exactly the right thing to say to me when I was down. But over the past decade or so, she has really started to show her true colors, and a lot of what her ex-husband said to me about her has begun to make more sense. For example, I have a very high-stress job. People bring me problems, and I fix those problems. But when I get home, 9 times out of 10, Anne just has more problems to throw onto my plate. She doesn't work, so she's free to do anything she wants to solve said problems during the day. But lately she has even begun making lists of things that she wants me to do after I work all day. But my biggest issue with Anne is that I can't ever really open up to her about anything. Whenever I talk about something bad that happened to me, she'll either try to one-up me or agree with the person who wronged me. Last Friday, I had a horrible day. There was an enormous problem at work that basically all fell on my shoulders to solve. When I was crossing the street after work, I had a green signal, and a bicycle blew through a red and side-clipped me. The cyclist yelled expletives at me and then rode away. I thought about calling the police because it was technically a hit and run, but there was probably nothing they could do. When I got home, desperate, I talked to Anne about what happened. She listened and then immediately took the cyclist's side. I reiterated that the cyclist ran through a red light, to which she responded that cyclists aren't obligated to stop. When I told her she was wrong and tried to put the issue to rest, she began frantically Googling laws. She found that in our state, they can treat lights like a stop sign. She began triumphantly reading the law to me loudly, word for word, getting louder when I kept trying to tell her that I wasn't interested. At the end of her spiel, she gave me this incredibly arrogant look as if she was right. I just stared at her for a second and said that my life would be better without her. She got incredibly upset, shrieked at me until her voice was hoarse, and then packed a bag and left to stay with her parents. She has texted me all weekend demanding an apology, but I haven't responded. Did I do something unforgivable here? Update 1. 2 weeks ago, I had an argument with my wife, Anne. This argument stemmed from Anne's incessant need to contradict me in everything I say. Anne left in a fit of rage to stay with her parents, and then kept spamming me with texts demanding an apology. A few days after Anne left, I felt something I hadn't in a long time at home: peace. I didn't have someone nagging me about literally everything I did. I didn't have to eat my meals in the correct order, something about pH balance that she probably saw from some brain rot creator on TikTok. I didn't have to wash my feet after getting home. I could actually enjoy myself, which is impossible when Anne is around, because I found many years ago that she tends to get the most aggressive when I seem like I'm either in a very good or very bad mood. I then did something I never thought I'd do. I reached out to her ex. He was more than eager to talk about Anne and her shenanigans, so we met up for drinks. He and I both had near-identical experiences with her. Anne is, through and through, a pretty horrible person, especially to her romantic partners. He cited irreconcilable differences for divorcing her, where it was no specific event, but just a long list of terrible interactions, and coming to the realization that he detested her as a person. During this time, Anne went silent on me. I used this lull in our relationship to visit a lawyer who told me that due to the nature of laws in our state and the fact that Anne is able-bodied and educated, the chances of me ever having to pay alimony are basically zero. I called Anne at that point. She, for some reason, still expected an apology. I told her that I wanted a divorce. She threatened to take everything from me. I said she could try, but any further contact should be done through my lawyer. I'm fully happy to split our assets fairly. I'm fairly sure that Anne will agree to any deal that gives her more than half. It's just the way she is. And if it's a 55-45 split, I don't care. All I'll have to do is act like she got the better of me, and since she's an idiot, she'll happily agree. Thanks to everyone who responded in the last post with advice. Tons of you suggested divorce, which I think was what actually got me to consider it seriously. Update 2. Alright, things have taken quite the turn. After I told Anne that I wanted a divorce, I half expected her to stay calm, or at least try to reason with me, maybe even agree since we'd been at odds for so long. But instead, she went completely off the rails. The threats started immediately. She started telling me she was going to take me for everything, as if we had some empire together that she could dismantle and conquer. It was almost cartoonish, but at the same time I could feel this dark undercurrent of desperation from her. Like she wasn't just saying these things because she wanted to win. It was more like she couldn't handle losing. It felt strange because for years she's always acted like I'm the one holding her back. The comments, the digs, the constant criticism. It always seemed like she felt like she was better than me, like she could have had a different life if I weren't around. So why now, all of a sudden, was she clinging so hard to this marriage? That's when I started to realize that maybe I wasn't just another failed relationship to her. Maybe she saw me as a safety net, a fallback plan, someone to prop up her self-image. If I was the one to leave her, that meant her little fantasy of superiority was falling apart. Anyway, after that phone call where I told her to deal with my lawyer, she went silent again for about 3 days. I thought maybe she was cooling off, but no. She showed up at the house. No warning, no heads up, just knocked on the door one evening like nothing was wrong. When I opened it, she walked right in and started talking like we hadn't had that conversation at all. It was weird. She began going on about some random stuff, how she'd been staying with her parents, how her mom was driving her nuts, how she missed our routine. I stood there watching her as she casually took off her coat, hung it up on the hook like she still lived here, and sat down on the couch like she was ready to watch TV with me. I let her go on for a bit because I was trying to figure out what was going on in her head. But then, after maybe 5 minutes of this, I told her she needed to leave. That's when she lost it. The calm demeanor just crumbled, and she started screaming at me, saying I was throwing everything away for no reason, that I'd regret it, that I wasn't thinking clearly. She kept going back to how we could fix things, how we just needed to talk this out like adults. At this point, I'd already decided I wasn't going to entertain the idea of reconciliation. There was nothing to reconcile. It wasn't a fight we were having. It was years of misery catching up to me. So I calmly told her again that I wanted her out of the house, and that any communication should go through our lawyers. Her response? She broke down, sobbing. This wasn't her usual drama queen routine. It was real, ugly crying. I won't lie, it got to me. Seeing her like that, I felt a pang of guilt, like maybe I was being too harsh. But then she started saying something that immediately snapped me back to reality. She started talking about how she had nowhere to go. I stopped her right there, reminded her that she was literally staying with her parents. She had a roof over her head. That's when the sobbing stopped for a second, and she looked at me with this cold, calculating expression and said, "You know that's not what I mean." It hit me then. She didn't want to go back to her parents' house because it wasn't about being homeless or abandoned. It was about control. If she was at her parents' place, she wasn't the queen of the castle anymore. She didn't get to make the rules. And more importantly, she didn't get to dictate my life. I think she realized at that moment that coming back to our house wasn't about trying to fix things between us. It was about her trying to regain the upper hand, to reestablish her role as the one who ran things. I didn't say anything to that. I just kept staring at her. Eventually, she stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out without another word. It was the eeriest thing, like a switch had flipped. 1 second she was a mess of emotions. The next she was completely composed, like she was running some script in her head, and this was just another part of the plan. As soon as the door shut behind her, I locked it. I didn't trust that she wouldn't just walk back in like nothing happened. After that, things went quiet again. No texts, no calls, just radio silence. I didn't know if I should be relieved or worried. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop, because with Anne, there's always another shoe. Sure enough, about a week later, I got a call from my lawyer. Apparently, Anne had filed a response to the divorce petition. And it wasn't just any response, it was a full-on attack. She was claiming emotional abuse, saying that I'd gaslit her throughout our marriage, that I was manipulative, controlling, all this wild stuff that was so far from the truth it was laughable. But I wasn't laughing. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to paint herself as the victim, so she could leverage that in the divorce proceedings. The thing is, I saw it coming. I'd been keeping detailed notes on everything that's been happening since the day she left, just in case things went sideways like this. My lawyer was prepared too. We're not worried about her claims, but it's exhausting having to deal with this level of pettiness. I always knew Anne had a flair for the dramatic, but to turn something that should have been a relatively simple divorce into a full-blown legal war? I didn't expect her to go this far. The more I think about it, the more I realize that Anne thrives on conflict. It's like she can't function without someone to be at odds with, without some kind of drama fueling her day-to-day life. And since I'd stopped giving her that, she had to find another way to get it. I won't lie, it's tough seeing someone you once loved turn into a complete stranger. But at the same time, I feel freer than I have in years. I'm not living under her constant scrutiny anymore. I don't have to walk on eggshells, wondering what minor thing will set her off next. There's still a long road ahead with this divorce, but at least now I know what I'm dealing with. And no matter how much she tries to drag me through the mud, I'm done being the person she unloads her issues on. Update 3. Well, this will probably be the last update. It's been a few months since my last post, and things have escalated in ways I didn't fully anticipate, though, at the same time, it's all somehow exactly what I expected from Anne. After her initial legal counter, things went dark for a while. She wasn't contacting me directly, thankfully, but I knew she was up to something because of the occasional legal surprises, random demands from her lawyer, claims of emotional abuse, financial requests that were completely unrealistic. It felt like she was throwing anything she could at the wall to see what would stick. But what really caught me off guard was when I found out that Anne had been reaching out to people in my life. Friends, family, even co-workers, trying to paint this narrative where I was some kind of controlling, manipulative monster. I started hearing from people I hadn't spoken to in years. One old colleague of mine messaged me on LinkedIn saying Anne had tried to connect with him, and she'd been sending long-winded messages about how I'd isolated her and how she needed help getting free. It was bizarre because, while we've had our issues, I was never anything but fair to her. If anything, I went out of my way to avoid conflict with her for years, just to keep the peace. I had a few friends who were genuinely concerned and reached out to me directly to ask what was going on. I explained the situation, and thankfully, most people saw through Anne's theatrics. But there were a couple of people who believed her, or at least wanted to stay neutral, and that was tough. It's strange when someone you've known for years suddenly thinks you're capable of being this villain your soon-to-be ex is describing. It was frustrating, but at the same time, I understood. Anne is very good at playing the victim. She can switch on the tears and the charm in a second, and for people who don't know her as well as I do, it's easy to get sucked into that narrative. Despite her attempts at a smear campaign, the divorce proceedings continued. My lawyer has been fantastic, keeping me grounded throughout this whole mess and making sure we're not getting sucked into her chaos. Anne's emotional abuse claims went absolutely nowhere because there was zero evidence to back them up. Every time she tried to make a new accusation, my lawyer was right there with receipts, texts, emails, even some old voice recordings I had of her going off on one of her usual tirades. The more she tried to fight, the more it became obvious to the court that she was just grasping at straws. But here's where things took a turn I wasn't expecting. Remember how I mentioned that Anne was staying with her parents after our blowout? Well, apparently, that wasn't going too well. From what I've gathered, mostly from her mother, The situation there was getting tense. Anne's parents are older, more traditional, and from what her mother hinted at, they were getting tired of her antics. The constant arguing, the complaining, the drama. Anne doesn't just reserve that for romantic relationships, it seems. Out of nowhere, I got a call from her mother. I hadn't spoken to her since this all started. She was always polite to me, but we never had much of a relationship. She called me in tears, apologizing for what Anne had become. She told me that she and Anne's father were done with her. They couldn't handle the stress anymore. Apparently, Anne had been making their lives hell, demanding money, complaining about how unfair her life was, even talking about moving back into their house permanently. Her mom begged me to finalize the divorce quickly, saying that maybe if the legal stuff was settled, Anne would finally leave them alone. That was when I realized how deep this all went. Anne wasn't just trying to destroy me. She was imploding everything around her. Her parents, her friends, everyone who had supported her was slowly pulling away because they couldn't take the chaos. And yet, she still refused to acknowledge that she was the common denominator in all this mess. At this point, I was just done. I didn't care about splitting hairs over assets or fighting for every little thing. I told my lawyer to offer Anne more than what I originally intended. The house, the car, even some extra money just to make it all go away. I didn't want to spend another second tied to this woman who was willing to burn her whole life down out of spite. It worked. Anne agreed to the terms without much of a fight. I guess, in the end, she just wanted to feel like she won something. Fine. Take it. Take it all, if it means I never have to deal with her again. The final paperwork was signed a few weeks ago, and I'm officially free. The whole process was exhausting, but the sense of relief I feel now is indescribable. Once the dust settled, I found out that Anne had moved in with some distant relative, but not before burning all her bridges with her parents. Apparently they'd cut her off financially after one too many outbursts, and she had nowhere else to go. I don't wish her ill, I never did, but it's hard to feel sorry for someone who refuses to see the consequences of their own actions. From what I've heard, she's still clinging to this idea that she was wronged, but that's no longer my problem. I'm finally out of the storm. As for me, well, life is looking up. It's strange being on my own after so many years of walking on eggshells, but it's a good kind of strange. I've reconnected with some friends I'd lost touch with over the years, people who had distanced themselves because they couldn't stand being around Anne. I've started focusing more on my health, both physical and mental. I didn't realize how much of a toll that relationship had taken on me until it was over. It feels like I'm finally breathing again after years of being underwater. I'm not rushing into anything new. For now, I'm just enjoying the quiet, enjoying being able to make my own decisions without second-guessing everything. It's wild how much space Anne took up in my head, even when she wasn't around. Now that she's gone, I feel like there's so much room for, well, me. Thanks again to everyone who followed along and offered advice. It's been a long, painful journey, but I can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that sometimes the hardest decision is the best one. I should have made it years ago.